smoothly this evening. There we go. Right, okay, so a couple of weeks ago then we were looking at portraits as usual, as we've been doing this term, and we've been using bleach to create like a reductive ink painting. So we've used the Parker Quink Inks to do that, and then some sanitizing fluid, which is this, which doesn't smell as harsh as ordinary bleach, and then we've used the bleach or the sanitizing fluid to remove areas to bring out the portrait. So the really dark areas of the portrait were left on the ink surface, and then the bleach was there to bring out all the highlights and things as well. Today what I thought we'd do is develop this technique a little bit further. Two things. First one would be to create a different sort of background to work on, and the other one was to start working back over the top with some of your acrylic paints and things as well. That said, you know, you can also use other materials too. You could use some colour pencils over the top and other things like that. So really we're getting a little bit experimental with what we're doing with those portraits. So I've done a little bit on the portrait of that beardy man that I was doing last week. I've done a little bit of acrylic on there just to show you what I mean, and then I'm going to start a new one with a different kind of background that I've sketched out ready to go. So we'll go over to the wall and I'll just remind everyone what we were doing. Okay, so you'll remember these two lovely portraits that I showed you before. Oh, he's gone. There she is. Right, so on this one I'd used the brusher inks, which I mentioned, but I've not obviously used those in the online classes purely because we haven't, most of us, got access to these things. So the principle is exactly the same. What we were doing is bleaching out some of the ink, and then what I did, which I didn't mention just a minute ago, was we used some of the rollable pens back over the top to create even darker tones. So the colour being, or the ink being, a mid-tone that can go lighter or darker and create the effect that we're looking for. So the photographs are the low-key photographs, really contrasty, black and white images, to give you the chance to be a bit experimental with colours and so forth as well today. So over to the next one. So this is what I was working on before last week. As I said, I've done a little bit more on that, and I was working from this photograph, bringing in the highlights. The other little things that I started to play around with during that lesson was also let me just bring that up. Was also I'm just trying to get him on so I can move him about a bit. There's that one, and that one. There we go. So one of the things I was doing is I was using, and you can just see it up there in the top corner. You can see that I was also printing with different materials. So I used a bit of I just happened to have a little bit of a old yoga mat, my old wife's old yoga mat, and I painted some of the sanitizer on it and just printed the surface of this picture. There's a little bit more down here. You can see these little dots just down the bottom there. So you can be quite experimental with the bleach. And then once that was done, I started to work into it with the mark making techniques that we've been learning quite a lot over the period of this series of lessons. So there's my rollable pen look, and you can see where I've been cross hatching and doing lots of different lines and dots and stipples back over the top. So right, let's just get rid of those a second. So one of the things that I was interested in as well was what we can do once we've done this kind of bleachy effect, which would be to work back over the top of those with some acrylic. Now here are two examples which I showed you last time. You can see clearly with this older lady down here that she has got she's got the bleachy brushstroke marks at the bottom of the face down here, and in different areas you can see that as well going on. But then we've got some, interestingly, we've got some colour on there as well, some like skin tones and things like that. So I thought it'd be interesting to see how we can develop our work a little bit like that as well. Just looking a bit closer, you can see the white brush strokes just on the hair there as a highlight. So we've got thin layers of paint applied back over the top to enhance the picture. And there, look, you can see as well around the eye some of the pen marks as well. And the other picture that I really liked was this one, just over here. Just undo that one. Let me just see if I can. Oh, I've lost it now. There it is. There we go. Right, so on this one, it's everything that I've just been talking about. I don't know about the bleach. It does look more like a painting. Some of the blacks around here and the colours next to them do look like the same sort of effect as bleach. So I think it's been bleached and then worked quite a lot into with paint. But if you look really closely, you can see some really interesting bits where there's little bits of words in there as well. Which is something that I really find interesting as an artist, as you know. So I've created a background portrait for tonight that we can have a look at, where I've put some colour down and then a wash of acrylic and then the ink back over the top. So I'm going to show you that now over on the desk. Yay, there we go. Right, so first of all, this one. You can see that I've added some blue over the top, and all that is getting a little bit of, well, I've got Fatalio blue here, but you can use more colours than that if you want to. I'm going to perhaps use a little bit of Fatalio green on my palette as well, and we'll zoom in a little bit, and that's it, it's nice and focused. And then some water. I just got my water over here. So there's my water, and just going to water the paint down slightly so that it's translucent. And then what you can do is, I'll do it on the beard down here, is you can brush over the top with the translucent layer of your chosen colour. And I suggest maybe just doing one or two colours like I'm doing here, so that we don't end up with too many to begin with, so that you can just try out the technique. So I'm overworking and overlapping some of the different colours you can see here. This provides a little bit of a base for us to work over. And I've found that the inks from the rollerball isn't running, perhaps because also I have left it to dry for a significant amount of time, which is almost 2 weeks now, as you know. So there we go. So we've got some pale colour on there, and then I'm going to switch to a smaller round brush. So I've got myself, well, it's just a blue one. I don't know what number it is or anything like that. Let's just zoom out slightly. So with this, I'm using a tiny bit of white. So from my massive pot, I'm going to put a little bit of white on there. You don't need a lot. And I'm going to use some black as well. Don't usually use much black, but we're going to go for it because we've got a black inked picture. And then what I can do is, looking at my photo, which is just up here on screen, I can start to apply some of the details. And I can also, at the same time, start to refine my picture and bring out some of that, some of the punchiness in the image, which perhaps I didn't get as much of with the bleach. So let's just see if I can. Whoop. There we go. And I'm going to grab my photo of my man and make him a bit bigger so we can see that eye. There we go. And move nice and sharp. And obviously you can see in that eye there's, and I'm going to use some greens in here as well. In the eye we've got the white of the eye, which is very strong, so I'm going to put that in, but there is also some shadows in there which I can start to add in, and you'll find it goes over the top really nicely. So the aim of it is to refine some of the edges, but also to perhaps bring out even further some of those highlights and perhaps even some of the shadows that we were working with last week. Okay, now if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to go over my old picture, of course, because perhaps you've finished that and you don't want to do any more on it, then please feel free to have a go at a new one, and then we can start to explore that a little bit more. So there you go, look, I put in some of that highlight from the eye, and I can see that I've got a few bits a little bit wrong there, so I can get my black and I can start just refining the edges. So this is where you can get really into the shapes and things. So that shape around the eye, the white of the eye, is quite slim around here, isn't it? So I'm just bringing that in slightly and darkening down around here, and then I can also add in perhaps some of the highlights that I lost on my last session. So I'm going to put in that highlight there and tone that white down, because I've got a couple more little grey ones just across here. And if they're not quite right, remember, don't forget about acrylics. They're really nice because you can go straight over the top of your acrylics. They're very forgiving like that, and you can build up some nice layers of colour in order to get everything the way that you originally intended. So I'm going to get really dark in here with a super dark grey green with the talio. Get in there a bit darker around the eye. And I can use water to dissipate it around the edges, which means to sort of spread it out but also blend it in a little bit more as well. And one thing I was doing earlier with the eyebrows, he's got these hairs that stand out a little bit more because they're white and things, and they've caught the light, so I can use my brush like this, sharpen up slightly more, a bit closer. Okay. There we are. Right, and so I'm just looking at the photo as it is on the screen here. Sometimes it's quite nice to work from a screen because you can do things like with your fingers zoom into stuff and get in closer to the detail, whereas you might be squinting at a photograph otherwise. So that's quite nice to do. And then there's these bits going along here which I can put in. They might be a bit light at the moment, but I can, when they're a bit drier, I can put a wash of colour back over those too. And I can put in extra highlights along here. It's good to have a tissue in your hand as well, so you can continuously sort of just wipe your brush a little bit. So don't let your paint get too thick, just apply it quite thin so that the inks underneath kind of go into or blend with, because they're transparent, blend with what you're already working with. So even with the darker tones you can do that as well, just gradually darken things down. Don't let it get too wet though, or don't overwork really wet areas, because if you're not using a nice thick paper, you'll find yourself going through a little bit. Okay, so obviously I've just worked on that very briefly, so you can see what I was thinking of for this evening. So I'll just shrink him back down because I want to show you the other one that I've planned to do. Get him. So this fellow just below him, just here, this man, I'm going to have a go at him as well because I really love this photograph. I like the highlights in the background and also the detail on the face and things, so I thought that would be quite nice to explore. But as I mentioned before, I've done something slightly different with this one. So here's my photograph that I've worked from, and you may not be able to see much at this stage actually, but yeah, it's a bit tricky to see it in this light because it's got pencil all over it. Let me see. It's quite interesting actually, you can see the highlights. But what I've done with this one is I've taken a piece of watercolor paper, and this doesn't have to be watercolor paper. I've then used newspaper over the whole surface, just around the center actually, not around the edges. I'll come out a little bit more, see if I can come out a bit more. There you go. So then what I've done is I've done a very, very watery thin wash once it's dry over the top with white acrylic, and that just softens down the harshness of the newsprint slightly. And then I've used the watered down ink over the top. So I haven't just used pure ink over the top, I've watered it down so that then we get a mid-tone over the top. And the interesting thing was actually, which didn't happen before, this is how the Quink ink looks when you just use it as it is. But with the, I think it might have been with the newsprint combined with the acrylic paint, it's some reason turns the ink a little bit bluish. So that's quite an interesting thing that's occurred there as well. So what I'll do with this one is I'll start working into it with the bleach again, or the sanitizing fluid, and then I'm going to start painting that to get that effect that I was showing you on the previous screen as well. So there's a couple of things to take our work forward a little bit, using collage backgrounds, but also just having a play with applying some acrylic paint over the top of your work as well. Limited colour palette is probably a good idea. You don't have to do that, you can go full on with the skin tones if you want to, but it's quite nice because it creates kind of a moody feeling to this particular image. So depending on what mood or feeling you want for yours, you might choose a different colour palette to work from. But this is just green, blue, primary blue or Fatalio blue, Fatalio green, white and black, simple, just like that. So I'll do a little bit more on this one, and then I'm going to start on this one as well. It's a shame you can't see it very well because of the lighting, but there you go. All right, okay. So, what does everyone think?
Didn't understand about the newsprint, Jamie. Did you stick it on?
Yes, yes. I used some of my PVA glue, and I just tore up some newsprint, avoided photographs, and just used words. So I'll try and get in a bit closer actually.
So you stuck fragments of newsprint, not one sheet over it?
Yeah, that's right, little fragments. Yeah, you can just about see it on here, look, but
I can see it, yes.
Yeah, there's a few other bits and pieces on there as well, but I've only done it in the centre where I knew the portrait was going to go, and then I sketched it on just before the class started, just to give me something to get straight into that with. Of course, you can use a grid straight over the top of that. So it was newsprint, then it was a very, very thin wash of white acrylic, so it's quite watery, and then once that's all dry, I then applied the Parker Quink ink in a very thin washed layer. Okay, so then I can start adding in some of this beautiful smelly stuff. So getting a bit closer. So hopefully it'll work. If it
So
doesn't,
what's this beautiful smelly stuff? It's ink.
bleach or
Oh,
sanitizer fluid. Yeah. So there you go. Look, I'm just adding some of that in now. Looks like I've just dripped some in the wrong place. Never mind. So I'm bleaching out that area of the eye just there. You can't see it very well on here. There it is. Look. Yeah. And I'm gonna bleach out, because I said I like that kind of white background area on the photograph. I'm gonna use a slightly larger brush and take some of that out as well to show the sides of the face and things like that too. Okay, so how does that sound, everyone? Is everyone okay with what to do? So you'll see me just now working on the portrait. I stained the Quink Ink and the pen, the rollable pen that I used before. I've stained that with some watered down acrylic. And so basically I can see through to the marks below, and I can work back over, change the mood and the feel of the picture. So I'm thinking a little bit like the one that's just up there on the screen, the painting that you can see. Now I use black, titanium white, Mars black, titanium white, and then Vitalio blue and Vitalio green to add in my colours and tints and tones back over the top of the tints and tones that I've already applied previously using the bleach and the Quink ink, as well as the ordinary ink, the Quink ink, and the rollable pen to add the textures. I'm working directly back over the top of those with acrylic paint, but I'm using thin layers of paint as opposed to heavier ones, and then I can go back a little bit later and apply my tints and my tones or highlights and shadows a bit more heavily, just like I'm doing right now on the nose and around the eye, the cheek sort of area of this very moody fellow's looking face here. In a minute I'll be working on the second portrait that I showed you earlier as well, where I work back over the top in exactly the same way, only I don't add the rollable pen. Now you can see I'm also applying thin lines to represent some of the whiskers back over some of the darker tones, so you get some of the depth in his whiskers or his beard or his moustache or whatever you want to call it, but I'm working back over the top there with some thin lines and so forth, and here I'm doing some washes of black and white to enhance some of the tones and shadows, as well as the highlights in the picture, and it starts to really bring the form of the face out. Obviously there's lots more I could do here, but as a piece to show you how that works, that works out pretty nicely. Now the shame is on this is that the pencil lines are a bit reflective, so it's difficult to see exactly what I'm doing at all times, but you can see it quite well here, can't you? You can see how some of the highlights I'm adding with the sanitizing fluid over the Quink ink is looking quite interesting. The interesting thing about this actually is that the Quink ink, when I watered it down and went back over a layer of white acrylic newspaper went blue, which is quite an interesting thing in itself. And then we've got this kind of orangey colour, yellowy, well, not yellowy, sort of more of a pale orangey sort of colour appearing. So you've got a bit of contrast between the blues and the oranges that are appearing as I bleach just here as well. So I'm using like stippling marks, lots of little lines and so forth. I'm constantly adding a little bit of water to the bleach and then putting more bleach back onto the brush. So I'm getting a variation in the strength of the bleach on the Quink ink at the same time. So it's creating quite a nice effect. It's bringing the portrait out of the pencil drawing so that we can start to see what's going on a little bit more. But you'll notice I mentioned this earlier, I liked the highlights around his face, the contrast that brings out his face. I like the highlights on the face as well, and the darkness of the shadows. It's a really nice photograph to work from for this exercise as well. In a few minutes you'll see that I stop doing this and I start working back in with some of my acrylic paints, and I've stuck again to a simple colour palette, exactly the same one really, blue, black, white, simple. And this is really because it's just fun keeping it nice and simple like this, because you can get involved with the mark making and just enjoy building those shadows up at the same time. So it is a lot of fun. You can see the eye emerging obviously out of the picture here. I'm constantly adding a little bit of water to dilute the paint as I go, to help blend it into the background. The nice thing about this as well, as I mentioned earlier, is I've added in some newsprint underneath. A few people asked me about the process of this again, so I'll repeat it again. What I did is I started with some watercolor paper, and then I tore up some text from the Times newspaper, and I basically collaged over sections over the surface of the paper with PVA paint. So that's painting the surface of the paper with PVA, applying the newspaper, and then applying glue back over the top of the newspaper, which in itself creates a kind of barrier between the paper and whatever you put on top, kind of a glossy sort of effect in a way really. But if you water down the PVA, it's obviously not as strong. And then following that, I then wanted to just soften down the strength, the darkness of the text from the newspaper. So I added a very thin wash of white acrylic over the top, a bit like what I just added alongside the face just now to highlight the edge of the face. So once I'd done that, I let it dry, and the final bit was watered down Quink ink over the top of the whole picture, so it created this kind of mid-tone, if you like. But that was where the interesting bit happened, and the ink started to turn a little bit bluey, which is it looks really, quite nice. And I didn't expect that, so that was quite a nice thing to discover whilst working. And then of course you just see me add in the bleach. I did let the picture, the paper dry before I started adding in the bleach. If you add in bleach while it's wet, you'll find often that the bleach will spread out uncontrollably, so it's a good idea to let it dry before you start working over the top. And then as you can see, I've been working over in a similar way to before with black, blue and white acrylic paint. Here I just finished off the lesson by adding some tints onto the surface of the paper too. But what I really like about this effect, as on the previous images on the studio wall, is the fact that you get little bits of the text peeping through the layers of paint and things like that. Oh, and this is me we were just talking about the possibility of doing a lino lesson in the future as well. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this lesson, and have a go, see how it goes. So a bleach portrait with acrylic and newspaper. Have a fantastic week and enjoy doing your art. Bye now.